This is a class that Clint introduced the 2 weeks prior to the lectureship in the auditorium, and we've kind of migrated this way. And we're going to be doing like a rotating teachers. So if you don't like my style, you get someone else next week. Who's on for next week, Clint? Pop quiz. Oh, Zach? Probably Zach for next week, which would be excellent. Yeah. So we're now going to be spending several weeks talking about how David dealt with conflict. And he's a natural character study in conflict. David's life is actually defined by a series of conflicts, right? Today we're going to look at his encounter with Goliath. But we could also think about his difficulties with Saul or his own family with Absalom, and I'm sure we'll be getting into that over the next several weeks. David's also a great study because he's described as a man after God's own heart. And someone addressed that during the lectureship as well. I'm like, oh, I got to write that down. So he's certainly not a perfect man, but he's a man who cares deeply about his relationship with God. And he's one that responds as God would like, right? He doesn't always make the best decisions. He usually does, and his decisions are usually God-centered, right? That relationship with God is the most important thing to him. Okay, so when do we often hear about David and Goliath today apart from the Bible? Like, if you're not in a Bible study, when would you hear about David and Goliath? Sports. I got sports, underdog, right? That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I can remember some classic David versus Goliath moments. So when I was growing up in Phoenix, I was a huge Phoenix Suns fan in the 1990s. It was both a good time and a difficult time because they never quite won that championship. But for me, a classic David versus Goliath moment from my childhood was when 6'1" Kevin Johnson dunked over 7-foot Hakeem Olajuwon in the playoffs. They still lost that game in the series, but it was a great moment. And it was one of those times where, he's just going right over the top of that guy. It almost looked like he was like climbing on top of him to get up to the rim. Or I think this one we were all pretty familiar with. I even looked this up recently, right? The 2007 Fiesta Bowl, it says Boise State slays Goliath, and I highlighted it here. It was billed as the David versus Goliath matchup, and there's the picture, the famous picture at the end of the game of the Statue of Liberty play. So we moved up here in the fall of 2006. So this was like my first Boise State experience with this season. I'm like, okay, now I'm a Boise State fan for life, which is getting a little bit better after a rough start this year. So today, David and Goliath, it's reduced to an underdog story in sports for the most part. But there's a lot from David's interaction that I'm hoping we can apply in our lives as we can sometimes face giant-sized conflicts of our own. So let's get into it. We're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 17. We're going to go through the text. I'll start by reading the first 11 verses. Now, the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soka, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soka and Azekah in Ephraim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side with the valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield-bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Okay, so here's the setup. Goliath is referred to as a champion. It's verse 4, and this is the idea of champion-style fighting. It's kind of an economical concept, the idea that why waste all this, shed all this blood, and we can just have our best 2 fighters fight, and that'll decide the battle. Doesn't sound too bad. It reminds me of duels that we read about in classic literature, like the Iliad, where you have your champions come on out and they just, fight it out. So this is a physical challenge. which if anyone my generation might remember the show Double Dare, be like physical challenge. Anyway, it's a physical challenge, but as we'll see, it's also a spiritual conflict. Often we try to split out our problems into like physical, emotional, or spiritual facets. I saw that even in the lectureship when we were talking about like marriage, for example. But these issues can have a holistic effect on us. And we'll come back to that idea at the end. So let's talk a minute about our conflicts. Like, what kind of conflicts do we struggle with, or what kind of people? I hope no one in your life is facing a literal 9-foot giant. But what are some of the things that you have to face on a day in and day out basis? I'll give you a second to think about it.
Work and life schedule, just busyness.
Yeah, busyness, work, life, stress. Yep. What else? I mean, this is a class on conflict. What can we learn about conflict if we don't have any? Do we not have any? That's kind of nice.
Raising kids.
Ooh, kids. Yeah, those little Goliaths. That's right. I like that. Yeah. Yeah. Traffic. Oh, I like that one. I didn't even have kids on here. I put family, but yeah, some of our, I said family, some of our greatest difficulties can be with our family. And sadly, I often think about like, you know, our adult family, which is kind of sad. Yeah, politics. That's getting hotter all the time. And it seems like the divide is getting greater, right? Yep. How about at work or at school? Coworkers, they can, you know, sometimes you have personality conflicts. Sometimes people are so ambitious that while they're climbing the ladder, they're climbing right over your career. That can get frustrating. A bad manager can ruin a job real fast, can make the difference between a good job and a bad job. Your manager can. And it's the same thing for a good or bad teacher. Sorry. Sadly, even friends sometimes. So a lot of our greatest conflict can be with friends. I was thinking about, David said this, and it turned out to be prophetic of Jesus. In Psalm 41:9, he says, "Even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me." So even David understood that sometimes your friendships can turn into some of your greatest conflicts. Dana, in the back.
Sometimes our biggest constant battle is ourselves.
Yep.
Getting out of our own way.
It's the next bullet point. Yep. Difficulty with self. Yep. Yeah. Stress of a situation can seem like a giant. Your insecurities, your fears. I think in the absence of a lot of external conflicts, we end up turning internally as well. I think we're struggling with that. Yeah.
Probably on the same lines as being temptations.
Oh, yeah.
Temptations can be a Goliath.
Temptations can be a Goliath in our life. Yeah. Alex?
Conflict of ideas.
Yep, definitely. A conflict of ideas. You want to go this way, someone wants to go that way. Yep. So when do these conflicts, I don't know, seem giant-sized? When do they seem jumbo-sized or super-sized? We don't say that anymore. But when is your conflict really just kind of out of control? Like,
I was just going to say, when you have no control. Like,
yeah.
The less control you have, the larger and more intimidating it is.
Right. Okay. So once it starts feeling out of your control, like it's its own thing now. Yeah. Alex. Oh yeah, yeah. When it actually gets to swords and spears, you're in a bad place. Yeah.
Sometimes just when it's not easy. I mean, a lot of the stuff we mentioned, we deal with all the time.
Yeah.
And we have conflicts with work, we have conflicts with family, we have conflicts with traffic or whatever. But when it's those times when this happened the other day and we worked it out quickly, now it's not working it out, so now it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's swelling.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good, Dana.
Kind of in line with that, it's new challenges, things you haven't faced before.
New challenges.
You know, typical is couples when they have the first child, all of a sudden dynamics change. All the old rules are probably out the window, maybe.
Right. Right as the baby carrier comes in the room there. Yeah. No, but yeah. Or they talk. That reminds me when they talk about like if you're ever. I don't know, I've heard it before, right? You want to try to limit those major life events. If you've had more than one a year, it can really throw you for a loop, and that's certainly one of them. A new kid, yep. Yeah, and there's something to be said about when it feels like you can't escape it anymore. I think this came up at the lectureship as well. He didn't use the word depression. Maybe it was despair, like the things that discourage. That's right, the lesson about things that discourage us. When you're in this feeling and it just kind of feels like you just get stuck there, like you're stuck in a rut, And I heard this recently somewhere else, that when you're really into depression, it feels like you're always going to feel this way. Like you're just not going to break out of that. For me, that's when it seems like a Goliath-like struggle, where it's like, I know this will pass, but when you're in the middle of it, it's like, man, is it ever going to change? Okay, I debated summarizing the next several verses, but I end up like saying more than the passage would, so let's just keep reading. Verse 12 in 1 Samuel 17. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle, and the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab the firstborn, and the next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Israelite came forward and took his stand morning and evening. And Jesse said to David his son, "Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commanders of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them." Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took the provisions and went. And Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were very much afraid. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel." And David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And the people answered him in the same way, "So shall it be to the man who kills him." Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." And David said, "What have I done now? Was it not but a word?" And he turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him as before. Okay, that was a bit of a longer reading, but again, I was afraid that if I summarize it, I'd just say more than what was there anyway. So David is introduced for a second time. He was introduced in the previous chapter as being already anointed king. He's the youngest of 8 sons. His 3 oldest brothers are fighting in Saul's army. Let's see. Yeah, I guess I got a little behind there. So David leaves the sheep in the field to take supplies to his brothers. This is interesting, as this is only one of 3 verses in the Bible to mention cheese, as he takes it to the commanders of the 1,000. It's not important in any way, but this passage always stuck out to me because of the cheese reference. I don't know. So he hears Goliath's challenge. He's immediately interested. And look again at the wording in verse 25 and 26. He's defying Israel. We have verse 26 on the board here. He's a reproach on Israel, and he's defying the armies of the living God. Bless you. So this is a challenge against Israel, but it's also a challenge against God. And David's making that very, very clear. I do have to ask, why does David ask in verse 26, "What shall be done for the man?" And I've kind of gone back and forth on this in the past as well. Is he reward seeking? Is he curious about the rewards? His brother's taken issue with him being there and snooping around. Any thoughts about why is David asking around about what's going on here?
Maybe he's wondering why nobody's done anything.
And I was kind of coming to the same conclusion as well. Maybe he's wondering why nobody has done anything. It's like, is there no great incentive? I mean, tax-free? Here, let's go. Right? Yeah, okay, let's continue on. Verse 31. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear, and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, I think I got this one on the board too. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Okay, so David doesn't go directly to Saul. Instead, people are paying attention to this guy going around trying to figure out what's going on, and word gets back to Saul. He gets brought before Saul, and Saul tells David that, first of all, he can't fight Goliath, but I wonder if he's calling in David to put him in his place, right? Like, this can't be good for morale when this little punk kid, this little teenager's coming in saying, oh, I can fight him. Why isn't anyone else going to fight him? They're like, dude, chill, right? So how does David respond? He said, I went after the lion, I killed the bear, I'll take down Goliath in the same way, basically. But it's not just about what he has done. And you can notice this in verse, when he's talking to Saul in verse 35, I went after him, I caught him, I struck him, I killed him, right? But then he turns around and gives credit to God in verse 37. He has done these things, but it is God that has delivered him from the bear, from the lion. So he recognizes God's faithfulness in his life and what God has done for him and through him. So I was kind of wondering, do you think God was on David's mind while he was shepherding? And it seems like it. We often have the picturesque version of David out in the fields, and he's holding a little harp, and he's like composing Psalm 23, right? The Lord is my shepherd. He probably was out in the field thinking about God, though. So when we're facing our giant issues and conflicts, we also need to remember God's faithfulness. God is taking care of us. He will take care of us. I've been in a number of discussions with my wife, even about like work stress and anxiety, and sometimes it's just generalized anxiety. Like, I'm not afraid of any negative repercussions. I'm not afraid of a bad review or getting fired or anything like that. But my wife has to remind me, and she does a great job of this. She's like, look, God's always taking care of us. God's going to continue to take care of us. And I really appreciate that mindset. And we definitely see it here in David as well. Part of looking forward and being able to deal with conflict is also looking backwards and seeing how God has been faithful to us. And hopefully for most of us in our lives, we can recognize some of that goodness.
John,
Yeah, Linder.
it's the same mindset that Joshua and Caleb had when we were going into this fight.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
They had the same thing. They knew that God said we can do it. It's just same kind of thing with trusting God.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So Linda reminded us about Joshua and Caleb, and I might get back to that at the end of the class as well. So very good. They also trusted in God and in His promises. Other thoughts? Yes, Cheryl.
Because we just look at that as attitude.
Mm-hmm.
He was looking at all of this from God's perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, he was looking at this from God's perspective. Absolutely. Yep. And it's interesting to see the impact that David has. Saul goes from someone who is, no, you can't do this, you can't fight this guy, to, verse 19, go and the Lord be with you. And the ESV throws in an exclamation mark. Suddenly, Saul is pretty excited, too, at this possibility. He's totally convinced Saul. Yeah.
It's interesting, our take on David, when we go back to 16,
Mm-hmm.
verse 18, when he's first introduced by one of the servants of Saul, says, I've seen the son of Jesse of Bethlehem and knows how to
Yeah.
play the harp. He's a brave man and a warrior.
Yeah,
Speaks well, is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him.
the Lord is with him.
He's got a reputation already, and I think sometimes we always think of David, the little shepherd boy. Like,
Yeah.
That's not quite accurate. But it's interesting to see him show up, and they do think he's not a fool
Yeah.
warrior, not part of the army at least.
Yeah, you got a good point there. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good call out on that verse. So the Lord was with them. Yep. Yeah, and I like that Saul also says the Lord be with you as well, right? So it's almost an infectious thought that maybe like we can think about this as like how we can approach our giants should give glory to God. And I'm talking to myself because usually when I get stressed out, I don't see the best of my behavior. But it's like, how can I think beforehand, like, okay, how can I turn this around and use this as an opportunity to give glory to God? Another personal example for me, I used to have a really excellent manager at my previous employer who was extremely calm. And we're getting into like, tense discussions, schedules are getting rough, and he's always just like even keel, mellow voiced. And there was no doubt that some of that was also because of his faith. He talked about waking up at 4:30 in the morning. I couldn't do that. And just praying, reading his Bible. But I want to have that kind of reputation as well. Now maybe I can't be calm because I'm a high energy guy, but that kind of people know that your inner calm comes from God, comes from your faith. All right, let's continue on. So, verse 38. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail, and David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Okay, so we're kind of setting the stage here for the big battle. But I've always liked this little passage, right? And here's kind of an artist's rendition of what that might look like. And I'm trying to figure out how can we, is there something here that we can pull out for ourselves as well? We all know that David doesn't go into battle with this armor because he hasn't tested it. It's not, sometimes you'll see this in the little kids stuff is like it's really bad fitting, he's this little guy and this big old helmet. But it doesn't give that impression. Instead, it gives the impression that this isn't something that David's accustomed to. So I think it's another good reminder for us today. Draw on your experiences. Draw on, like what's worked well in the past. Maybe it's go with your strengths. He's not a swordsman. He's a shepherd with the sling. I think there's something for us in that as well. Any other thoughts on that? Is there a practical example for us today from these 2 verses when we're dealing with conflict? Clint.
I just honestly, I've always kind of looked at this as Saul kind of throwing up his hands and going, whatever, kid, go give it a shot. And then when he goes to wear the armor, I've always kind of had that mental image of the kid with the dad's hat and jacket down there. But I mean, looking at it in this slide, and I mean, even that picture. I mean, Saul was noted for his size.
He's a tall guy, yeah.
So, I mean, David must have been a pretty strapping guy himself, or Saul wouldn't have even thought to have him try his stuff on.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
But like to Dana's point, I mean, David's reputation preceded him. So, I mean, you think about you're in a workplace environment or whatever environment dealing with conflict, if your boss or coworker or whatever knows, hey man, he's dealt with this stuff before, let's bring him in because we've seen how he handles things. I mean, like I said, it kind of changes my perspective of this a little bit. I've always been very cynical of this whole scene.
Yeah. Dana in the back.
I think of this from Saul's perspective
Mm-hmm.
and telling him, well, go out and do this then. I think that applies to us as parents, because a lot of times we see our own children in conflict, and we think, well, just do that.
Yeah.
We do.
Or do it my
We
way.
might not be wired that way.
Yeah, that's a good point. Or I want you to solve it the way I would solve it. Yeah, that's really kind of neat, thinking about it from Saul's perspective. Yeah, he's trying to give him the best tools available, but that's not really going to be his way. That's cool. Linda, did you have something too?
Thinking, that's not where his trust was at.
Yeah.
In those things.
Yep.
It was very simple and pure. It's just his trust in God.
Yeah.
I'm not saying they didn't wear those kinds of things, but a lot of times that's what we do. We think our bank accounts or whatever, that's where we put our
Yeah.
trust in.
Yeah.
And that's not where we have to put our trust in God first.
Yeah. So where's your security? That makes sense. And Jeremy, did you have something too?
Again, picking up on what Dana's saying over there, again, I'm thinking about kids and, you try to get out there and plow the way for them sometimes and, put on the armor for them and send them out, and they go, you know what, I haven't been trained yet. So I'm using the word training here.
Mm-hmm.
And when somebody's not, give them, and sometimes they have to just go do it their way.
Mm-hmm.
How they know how to approach the situation, and
Go with what they know.
kind of have to step back and let them kind of figure things out.
Yeah, it's a good call out. Okay, let's continue on. We're getting to the actual battle here. Verse 41, and the Philistine. I want to make sure I keep advancing the slide. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and a spear." Oh, excuse me, I don't want to get ahead to his response just yet. So here's the challenge, right, from Goliath. It says in verse 43 that he cursed David by his gods. The study guide does a good job of calling out what are some of these gods. Well, first of all, we have, went backwards. First of all, we have Dagon. This is the half-man, half-fish deity that God utterly embarrassed earlier in 1 Samuel. You'll remember when the Ark of the Covenant is taken to Ashdod, and the hands and the head are like, the idol falls over, and so the Philistines don't touch the threshold. Anyway, and then we have Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies. That's kind of nasty. And it's interesting, this is called out in the study guide. These are the same flies that fly around, like excrement and waste. And these are the gods that the Philistines had sold their souls to. So this is a physical conflict, but it's easy to see how it's tied into a spiritual conflict right here. It's one and the same for these people, for both the Philistines and for David and the Israelites. All right, let's get to David's response. I was so excited I kept reading. Verse 45, Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with the sword and with the spear and with the javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." Okay, so here's the confrontation and David's response. So throughout the Old Testament, there's different qualifiers given to God in different situations. We can think of in Genesis 22 when Abraham is going to sacrifice Isaac and the Lord provides a ram. Abraham says, "Jehovah Jireh." He says, "The Lord will provide." Or we can think of in Judges chapter 6 when Gideon is approached by the angel of the Lord. He says, "Jehovah Shalom," the Lord is peace, because he is granted peace with God. Or after the Israelites defeat Amalek in Exodus 17, when Joshua was first mentioned as a general in that context, Moses says, "Jehovah Nisi," the Lord is my banner. So in this conflict, when facing down a giant, David calls upon Jehovah Sabaoth, the Lord of armies, or the Lord of hosts, might be in many of your Bibles. And I kind of like the Lord of armies. I know Clint reads from the Christian Standard now that renders it that way. I think it's a more modern day rendering. You say Lord of hosts, and it sounds like something from Lord of the Rings, right? A great host. So when going into combat, David calls upon the Lord of armies. When facing a spiritual conflict, we can call on the Lord of armies as well. We can call on God. Jehovah Sabaoth, it's a powerful name. David's confidence is in the Lord of armies. It's not in himself. And of course, famously, probably the most famous verse in this entire section, "The battle is the Lord's," verse 47. But also notice, and I didn't highlight all this assembly, but all the earth may know that there's a God in Israel. All this assembly may know that the Lord saves. This is David wants to make it very clear, right? The Lord is fighting this battle, but I want everyone to know it too. And he's not just talking to Israel. He says, all this great assembly, both sides of the mountain here, they're in the valley being together. He wants everyone to know that it's the battle belongs to the Lord, as we like to sing. Any other thoughts or comments on that before we move ahead? Okay, we don't have a lot of time, so I didn't want to give you that much time anyway. All right, verse 48. when the Philistine arose, and actually, hold on a second. So I have to point this out. This is going to be just awful. So this is, does anyone, I actually will call for a show of hands. Anyone remember the old Hanna-Barbera Bible story cartoons? There's a couple back in the resource room as well. This was the moment when like Goliath is going to attack David, and he's like, "Rah!" But as a kid, this was terrifying, and it gets, it's still pretty terrifying. Let me just say, they don't make cartoons like this anymore, because I watched this with the kids. They reposted them on YouTube. You can search for Hanna-Barbera Bible stories. And like when Goliath gets into the forest, it's like this big fountain of blood. It's awful. It's like, wow, okay. It was kind of violent. Now I just kind of laugh at this imagery, but it makes me question as well. And this is all just idle speculation, but is David afraid? Is he fearful? The Bible doesn't say. If anything, he comes off as, I don't know, utterly confident, right? He's not intimidated by this huge giant. So I have to also ask, was David afraid when the lion or the bear attacked? Again, if we look back at verse 35, he is pursuing a lion. He is pursuing a bear. It's not that a lion or a mountain lion comes up and attacks him. He's actually going out and attacking the lion and the bear. So I don't know. It's just kind of speculation on my part. But I was reading this. I got to get that off the screen. Sorry. All right, there we go. I was reading this book recently that included a sentence that kind of caught me off guard. It said, "Fear is a bad word, and though we may know it, we do not talk about it nor let it influence our behavior." And it's like, whoa, I'm going to highlight that, because I think in our society today, or at least for myself, it's almost like we get to the point where we're celebrating our fears, where it's okay. It's okay to be afraid. But like we focus too much on our phobias. We focus too much on our fears, and they can be debilitating if we let it, if we let them be. So is David afraid? I don't know. Maybe not. It seems like he would be foolhardy to not have some sort of fear, but it's not controlling him, obviously. It's not taking over. Any thoughts on that? I just kind of rambled for a couple minutes.
Well, I would say I think it's a cautious confidence. I mean, he's prepared.
Mm-hmm.
He knew the armor wasn't for him, but he knew the stones and the sling were.
Right. Yep.
His confidence is in God. So I mean, that big bouncy face coming at him, he's gonna be a little bit. I mean, just common sense. He's gonna be
Ready.
have to steel himself a little bit.
Yeah.
But it seems like fear might not be the right word.
Yeah. Maybe it's confidence. Yeah. Rebecca? And then I'll get Sam in the back.
And also, just thinking like you can have fear, but you can set it aside to do the task at hand.
Yeah.
It's not like it's not there. It's just not what's ruling you.
Yeah.
At the moment. But also, I was just thinking about, with the kids sometimes when they are afraid when they were little, I tried to make them more afraid of me than whatever they were afraid of.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Because, I'm scarier than the made-up monster in the closet.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So, it's kind of perspective. What happens if David loses? Maybe a bigger fear is not, I don't know. It's not necessarily Goliath. It's other things.
Maybe he has a greater fear of God. That's an interesting idea. Okay. Yeah, I like that. We're going to go Stan and then up to Cheryl. Stan?
Talking about fear, I was just wondering, why did he pick up 5 stones?
Right.
I mean, if he knew that God was faithful and God was on his side, 1 stone would have worked.
Yeah.
Maybe, I read some commentaries where maybe they said that Goliath had brothers,
4 brothers. Yeah.
and so he picked those stones up for him too.
Yeah. I've heard that as well. Like, why the 5 stones? Is it because he's ready to fight Goliath's brothers? Is it because he can still trust in God and have multiple rounds? I don't know. That's a good question. Cheryl.
My thought came with Rebecca's comment, beginning that if he had fear, he probably did. He didn't keep it.
Didn't keep it.
Takes
Yeah.
you back to remembering Jesus' 3 prayers in Gethsemane.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He was very, I say he was very afraid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Certainly had a lot of anxiety, so much that he
blood,
Right.
sweat blood, but his confidence in the power that God was with him.
Yeah. Yeah, very
He
good.
could see perfect calm.
That replaced it. Yeah. Yeah, after that point, he is just totally all in, all committed. Yep. Brandon.
Well, I'm wondering too if, as it talks about the lion and the bear, and
Mm-hmm.
they'd attack the sheep. Well, we see the relationship with the shepherd and the sheep, and there could have been some fear there, but his commitment and his devotion to that group of sheep or that sheep that was in danger, that may have overcame it.
Yeah.
We would say the same thing. I think if we looked at someone trying to attack our family,
Yeah.
there would be a fear there maybe, but it's going to pale in comparison. You're going to put it away until you're going to do everything you can to protect, and maybe that was part of how he was looking at Israel too.
Yeah, he's certainly not focused on his fear. Certainly not his fear of Goliath. I agree with that. Okay, let's keep going. Verse 48. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with the sling and a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shaaraim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. Okay. I did want to say quickly about the sling. So I saw this quote online, and many of you have probably heard this as well, and it was in the Hanna-Barbera cartoon, right? He's swinging the thing around like some sort of rodeo. But it says that slingers are often visualized as releasing overhead, yet the best way to utilize a sling is with an underhand motion like a softball pitcher. Elaborate wind-ups were wasted motion. One wind-up like a good softball pitcher was sufficient, and this stone, which is pretty decently sized, could have been like the size of a baseball or a tennis ball. It could be going faster than 60 miles an hour, which is pretty devastating. So David triumphs over Goliath with the sling. Now I have to ask, I was asking myself, how was God involved in this battle? So David is taking action. God's on his side. Is God directing his abilities? Is he directing the stone, the wind? Did God direct the circumstances of the day? Was it hot? Was Goliath suddenly overconfident because he'd been up there 40 days and he takes his helmet off? I guess he still has his helmet. But I try to ask myself, okay, so battle is the Lord's. How's God involved in this battle? Just because we're running out of time, and I would like to discuss it some more, and somewhat it is speculation because we don't totally understand all that, right? I don't understand how God works in our lives all the time, but He does, and we have faith that He does. David had faith in God's ability to act through him, and it happened. It's a very interesting story for how much it's David did this, David did that, but David's going, God allowed me to do this. God, helped me to do that. God has been faithful. One of the verses that comes to mind, I'll put it up on the board here, Ecclesiastes 9:11. Again, I saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all. This is kind of Solomon's look at it. And I've always thought that that's an interesting verse because who controls time and chance? Well, God's not mentioned in this verse, but I kind of see it there. To me, time and chance happens to them. It seems very providential, right? So God's controlling these things in ways that I can totally understand. And maybe it was also blessing David with abilities. So we only have 5 minutes left. I'd love to dwell more on this, but maybe we can discuss it after class instead. Or I'll come to Zach's time next week. You should discuss it with Zach next week. All right, what conclusions can we draw from David's conflict with Goliath? Actually, I have 3 verses that I'd like to pull out from Paul. First of all, Romans 8:31. If God is for us, who can be against us? I was thinking about back to Numbers 13, which Linda brought up earlier, the spies going into Canaan. That terrible verse we looked at last quarter, Numbers 13:33, and we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. So David doesn't see himself as a little boy fighting a giant. That's what everyone else is seeing. He sees himself as backed by the Lord of armies instead. He's got God on his side. So if God is for us, who can be against us? And then, like David, we can also look to our past to see how God has been faithful in our lives, how he has blessed us in the past. Again, back to Paul, I love this verse. I actually really love 2 Corinthians chapter 1 because it's a case study in like depression and how a man of God deals with it. 2 Corinthians 1:10, speaking of God, he delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us. On him we have set our hope that he will deliver us again. Paul looks to his past, says, God has delivered me out of all these terrible things, so I have confidence that in the future he will do the same. And then lastly, we are in a spiritual battle. One more time from Paul. Ephesians 6:12, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. So this is back to that idea that we talked about earlier. Sometimes we like to split our lives and just kind of act like we can fragment it into, oh yes, this is my physical well-being, this is my emotional well-being, this is my spiritual well-being. And there are different ways that you can emphasize those things, like we talked about in the lectureship on marriage and our relationship with our spouse. But our conflicts will have an impact on us holistically as well. If we're struggling physically, like if we're sick, that can get us down emotionally. It can even get us down spiritually. Why am I struggling with this? Why am I not, feeling better? So any one of these struggles can cross over. And I think in David's life, David understood this as well. He could see the spiritual struggle around him, and he knew which side he wanted to be on. We could see that he can look through the curtain of, this is a conflict that I'm facing, and instead take it back to his relationship with God. Okay, any other thoughts on that? I just kind of breezed right through my takeaways. Any takeaways that we missed, or any thoughts on these three verses? Linda.
Mostly the attitude that his brothers had towards him.
Mm-hmm.
Also, how we can have an attitude like that.
Yeah.
Not like, yeah, I'm really not trusting in God. Instead of saying, pointing your finger at somebody, it reprove them.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. I mean,
Okay.
like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Because
Mm-hmm.
they're saying their brother, they should be thinking or doing the same thing that their brother is saying to them. And sometimes I would take that as, wow, I'm not, like your kids, when your kids reprove you like that, like, Mom, you should have more trust in that. You know how God's supplied before.
Mm.
I don't like having that attitude. Not like I think like they did towards David.
Yeah.
Saying, yeah, I really same mindset. I'm just saying how our attitudes, how you can look at somebody and have the wrong.
Yeah.
That's just something.
Yeah, that makes sense. His brothers are an interesting, study too. I totally agree. Yep. Alex? That's interesting. Maybe he knew what he was going to say to Goliath. That's an interesting thought too. Yeah, there was just the Lord. And yeah, in the back, Jeff.
It says before David, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So when you're afraid, to me it stands out as it's time to take action.
Time to take action. Yeah.
You can't just sit back and wait because then the fear becomes worse.
That's a really great point. Fear can be paralyzing, and I've seen this even in my own work life, where it's like I'm afraid to take action. There's all these different choices. So yeah, fear can be paralyzing, and we don't see that out of David. Instead, he's taking action, he arose quickly. Excellent. Appreciate that thought. Okay, final thought. This is the first major conflict that we read about in David's life. It will be his simplest conflict, or maybe the one that is the quickest to resolve. The other conflicts that we're going to look in David's life are going to be long, protracted affairs that are going to be severe trials for David. They're going to last for years. But David's faith in God and in God's judgment is going to remain consistent. So I hope you can join us next week as we continue to look into David's life. Thanks. And thanks for all the comments this morning. Really appreciate it.